Chapter 10, The Marauder's Map. Madame Pomfrey insisted on keeping Harry in the hospital wing for the rest of the weekend. He didn't argue or complain, but he wouldn't let her throw away that shattered the remnant of his Nimbus 2000. He knew he was being stupid. He knew that the Nimbus was beyond repair, but Harry couldn't help it. He felt as though he had lost one of his best friends. He had a stream of visitors, all intent on cheering him up. Hagrid sent him a bunch of ear-wiggly flowers that looked like yellow cabbages. Ginny Weasley, blushing furiously, turned up with a get-well card that she had made herself, which sang shrilly unless Harry kept it shut under his bowl of fruit. The Gryffindor team visited again on Sunday morning, this time accompanied by Wood, who told Harry, in a hollow, dead sort of voice, that he didn't blame him in the slightest. Ron and Hermione left Harry's bedside only at night, but nothing anyone said or did could make Harry feel any better, because he knew only half of what was troubling him. He hadn't told anyone about the Grim, not even Ron or Hermione, because he knew Ron would panic and Hermione would scoff. The fact that, however, that it had been now appeared twice, and both appearances had been followed near fatal accidents. The first time, he had nearly been run over by the Knight's bus. The second, fallen 50 feet from the broomstick. Was the Grim going to haunt him until he actually died? Was he going to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for the beast? And then there were the Dementors. Harry felt sick and humiliated every time he thought of them. Everyone said the Dementors were horrible, but no one else collapsed every time they were near them, or near one. No one else heard echoes in their head of their dying parents, because Harry knew who that screaming voice belonged to now. He had heard her words, heard them over and over again during the night hours of the hospital wing, while he lay there staring at the strips of moonlight on the ceiling. When the Dementors approached him, he heard the last moments of his mother's life, her attempts to protect Harry from Lord Voldemort, and Voldemort's laughter before he murdered her. Harry dozed fitfully, sinking into dreams full of clammy, rotted hands and petrified pleading, jerking awake to dwell again on his mother's voice. It was a relief to turn back to the noise and bustle of the main school on Monday, where he was forced to think about other things. If he had to endure Draco Malfoy's taunting, Malfoy was almost beside himself with glee at the Gryffindor's defeat. He had finally taken off his bandages and celebrated having the full use of both arms again by doing spirited imitations of Harry falling off his broom. Malfoy spent much of the next potions class doing Dementor imitations across the dungeon. Ron finally cracked and flung a large, slippery crocodile heart at Malfoy, which hit him in the face and caused Snape to take 50 points from Gryffindor. If Snape's watching Defense Against Arts again, I'm skiving off, said Ron, as he beaded down towards Lupin's room after lunch. Check who's in there, Hermione. Hermione peered around the corner door. It's okay. Professor Lupin was back at work. Certainly looked as though he had been ill. His old robes were hanging more loosely on him than they were. Dark shadows beneath his eyes. Nevertheless, he smiled at the class as they took their seats, and they burst out at once with an explosion of complaints about Snape's behavior while Lupin had been ill. It's not fair. He was only filling in. Why should he give us homework? We don't know anything about werewolves. 2 rolls of parchment? Did you tell Professor Snape we haven't covered them yet? Lupin asked, frowning slightly. The babble broke out again. Yes, but he said we would really be behind. He wouldn't listen. 2 rolls of parchment. Professor Lupin smiled, with a look of indignation on every face. Oh, don't worry, I'll speak to Professor Snape. You don't have to do the essay. Oh, no, said Hermione, looking disappointed. I've already finished it. They had a very enjoyable lesson. Professor Lupin had brought along a glass box containing Hickey-Punk, a little one-legged creature who looked as though he were made of wisps of smoke and rather frail and harmless-looking. Lutes travellers into bog, said Professor Lupin, as he took the notes. You notice a lantern dangling from his hand. Hops ahead, people follow the light. Then the Hickey-Punk made a horrible squelching noise against the glass. When the bell rang, everyone gathered up their things and headed for the door, Harry among them. But, wait a moment, Harry, Lupin called. I'd like a word. Harry doubled back and watched Professor Lupin covering Hickey-Punk's box with the cloth. I heard about the match, said Lupin, turning his back to his desk and staring at a pile of books on the briefcase. I'm sorry about your broomstick. Is there any chance of fixing it? No, said Harry. The tree smashed it to bits. Lupin laughed. Yeah, they planted that whooping willow the same year that I arrived at Hogwarts. People used to play a game, trying to get near enough to touch the trunk. In the end, a boy called Davy Gungeon nearly lost an eye, and we were forbidden to go near it. No broomstick could have a chance. Did you hear about the Dementors, too? Harry asked with difficulty. Lupin looked at him quickly. Yes, I did. You don't think any of us haven't seen Professor Dumbledore that angry. They have been growing restless for some time, furious about his refusal to let them inside the grounds. I suppose they were the reason you fell? Yes, said Harry. He hesitated, and then he questioned. He had to ask burst out of him before he could help himself. Why? Why do they affect me like that? I'm just... It has nothing to do with weakness, said Professor Lupin sharply, as though he had read Harry's mind. The Dementors affect you worse than the others because there are horrors in your past that others don't have. A ray of wintry sunlight fell across the classroom, illuminating Lupin's gray hairs and the lines on his young face. Dementors are among the foulest creatures that walk this earth. They infest the darkness and filthiest places. They glory in decay and despair. They drain peace, they hope, and happiness out of the air around them. Even muggles feel their presence, though they can't see them. Get too near a Dementor, and every good feeling, every happy memory will be sucked right out of you. If it can, a Dementor will feed on you as long enough to reduce you to something like itself, soulless and evil. You'll be left with nothing, the worst experience of your life, and the worst that has happened to you. Harry, it's enough to make anyone fall off their broom. You have nothing to be ashamed of. When they get near me, Harry said at Lupin's desk, his throat tight, I can hear Voldemort ordering my mom. Lupin made a sudden motion with his arm, as though as to grip Harry's shoulders, but he thought better of it. There was a moment's silence then. Why did they have to come to the match? Said Harry bitterly. They're getting hungry, said Lupin coolly, shutting his briefcase with a snap. Dumbledore won't let them into school, so that supply of human prey has dried up. I don't think they could remove a large crowd around the Quidditch field, but the excitement and emotions running high. It was their idea of a feast. Azkaban must be terrible, Harry muttered, as Lupin nodded grimly. The fortress is set up on a tiny island way out in the sea, but they don't need walls and water to keep prisoners in, not that they're all trapped inside their own heads, incapable of a single cheerful thought. Most of them go mad within weeks. But Sirius Black escaped from them, Harry said slowly. He got away. Lupin's briefcase slipped from the desk. He had to stoop quickly to catch it. Yes, Dementors, he said, straightening up. Black must have found a way to fight them. I wouldn't have believed it possible. Dementors are supposed to drain the wizard of his powers. If he is left with them too long. You made the Dementor on the train back off, said Harry suddenly. There are certain defenses one can use, said Lupin. But there was only one Dementor on the train. The more there are, the more difficult it is to resist. What defenses? Harry said at once. Can you teach me? Ooh, I don't depend to be an expert on fighting Dementors, Harry. Quite the contrary. But if the Dementors come another Quidditch match, I need to be able to fight them. Lupin looked into Harry's determined face and hesitated. Then he said, Well, all right. I'll try to help. But it'll have to wait until next term, I'm afraid. I have a lot to do before the holidays. I chose a very inconvenient time to fall ill. With that promise, the anti-Dementor lesson from Lupin, the thought that he might never have to hear his mother's death again, and the fact that the Ravenclaw flattened Hufflepuff in Quidditch match at the end of November, Harry's mood took a definite upturn. Gryffindor were not out of the running after all, although they could not afford to lose another match. Wood became reposed of his maniac energy and worked on his team hard as ever in the chilly haze of the rain and persisted into December. Harry saw no hint of a Dementor within the grounds. Dumbledore's anger seemed to be keeping them at the stations at the entrances. 2 weeks before the end of the term, the sky lightened, and suddenly a dazzling opaline white and muddy grounds which revealed one morning covered with glittering frost. Inside the castle there was a buzz of Christmas in the air. Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, had already decorated his classroom with shimmering lights and turned out to be real, fluttering fairies. And students were all happy discussing plans for the holiday. Both Ron and Hermione had decided to remain at Hogwarts, and though Ron said it was only because he couldn't stand 2 weeks with Percy, and Hermione insisted she needed to use the library, Harry wasn't fooled. They were doing it to keep him company, and he was very grateful. To everyone's delight, except Harry, there was to be another Hogsmeade trip the very last week of the term. We can do all our Christmas shopping there, said Hermione. Mom and Dad would really love those tooth-flossing string minus from the Honeydukes. Resigned to the fact that he would be only the third year staying behind, Harry borrowed a copy of Witch Broomstick from Wood and decided to spend the day reading up on the different makes. He had been riding one in the school brooms for the team practices, an ancient shooting star, which was very slow and jerky. It definitely needed a new broom of its own. So on Sunday morning of the Hogsmeade trip, Harry bid goodbye to Ron and Hermione, who were wrapped in cloaks and scarves, and turned up the marble staircase alone, and he headed back towards the Gryffindor Tower. Snow had started to fall outside, and the windows of the castle where it was very still and quiet. Psst, Harry! He turned halfway around the third floor to see Fred and George peering out at him behind the statue of the humpbacked one-eyed witch. What are you doing? Harry said curiously. How come you're not going to Hogsmeade? Huh? We've come to give you a bit of festive cheer before we go, said Fred with a mysterious wink. Come in here. He nodded towards the empty classroom to the left of the one-eyed statue. Harry followed Fred and George. George closed the door quickly and turned it, beaming at Harry. Early Christmas present for you, Harry, he said. First, Fred pulled something from inside his cloak with a flourish and laid it to one of the desks. It was a large, square, very warm place of parchment with nothing written on it. Harry, suspecting one of Fred and George's jokes, stared at it. What's that supposed to be? This, Harry, is the secret of our success, said George, patting the parchment fondly. It's a wrench. Giving it to you, said Fred. But we've decided last night that you need it greater than ours. Anyway, we know it by heart, said George. We bequeath it to you. We don't really need it any more. And what do I need with a bit of old parchment? Said Harry. A bit of old parchment? Said Fred, closing his eyes with a grimace as though Harry mortally offended him. Explain, George. Well, when we were in our first year, Harry, young, carefree, and innocent. Harry snorted and doubted whether Fred and George had ever been innocent. Well, more innocent than we are now. We got into a spot of bother with Filch. We let off a dung bomb in the corridor, and it upset him for some reason. So he hauled off out of his office and started threatening us with the usual detention, disembowelment, and we couldn't help but noticing a drawer in one of his filing cabinets marked confiscated and highly dangerous. Don't tell me, said Harry, starting to grin. Well, what would you have done? Said Fred. George has caused a diversion, dropped another dung bomb, and whipped the drawer open and grabbed this. It's not as bad as it sounds, you know, said George. We don't reckon Filch ever found out how it worked. He probably suspected that what it was, though, because he wouldn't have confiscated it. And you now know how to work it. Oh, yes, said Fred, smirking. A little beauty taught us more than the teachers have ever had at this school. You're winding me up, said Harry, looking at the ragged old piece of parchment. Oh, we are, said George. He took his wand out, touched the parchment lightly, and said, I solemnly swear I'm up to no good. And at once the ink and the lines spread like spider webs from the point of George's wand where it touched. They joined each other and crisscrossed and fanned into every corner and parchment. Then the words came into blossom across the top. Great, curly, green words proclaimed, Mercy, Mers, Mooney, Dormtail, Padfoot, and Prong, purveyors and aids to the magical mischief maker, and the proud to present the Marauder's map.